to have a guest speaker. This is Professor Valantasis from the Iliff School of Theology. I wanted to share with you, I came across his work in this volume from Oxford University Press. It's a collection of essays on asceticism, and he's co-editor of the volume and also has a contribution. So I had this idea as we were setting up this meeting to celebrate Nietzsche's birthday to invite him to discuss asceticism with us. And the paper he's presenting today is Theorizing Asceticism After Nietzsche. So please join me in welcoming Professor Valantasis here at UCB.
I warn you, there's not going to be much philosophy in this. And I'm glad of that, because one never carries cold to Newcastle. I have worked in the theory of asceticism for about 15 years. And what you're hearing today has actually very little to do with my theory of asceticism, but thoughts as I have been reading in and around the field over the past few years, and I use this as an opportunity to pull together some material. Stop me when you have any questions. The word asceticism is not a common part of popular scholarly discourse. It conjures from many ancient and medieval practices intended to mortify the body. Mortification, or the punishment of the body, might require hair shirts with lice in secret, worn in secret next to the skin, or intense fasting and rejection of the pleasures of food and drink, or abstinence from sexual pleasure and the rejection of marriage with its attendant sexual engagement, or the rejection of society and the pleasures of normal social relationships in favor of dark caves and isolated monasteries in some remote site of Egypt or Syria. These practices were indeed ascetical, but when viewed as isolated practice, they tell us only part of the story. In order to get to the heart of an ascetical discipline, one must ask the question about the intent or the purpose or the goal of the practice. To what end, or why does an ascetic wear a hair shirt? What kind of a body does fasting fashion? What kind of intimacy does chastity construct? What kind of society is created by withdrawing from normal social relations? The ascetic practices always connect to some larger purpose, to a wider conception of human existence or human potential, to a different understanding of society and the world. The goal of the practice relates to creating this different person, whose life, at least in the common understanding of asceticism, depends on discomfort, renunciation, and withdrawal to create a more perfect person. This paper will explore the wider context for ascetical theorizing. Let me get a little bit more deeply into what happens when someone wears a hair shirt or fasts or renounces sexuality. When a person decides to wear a lice-infested hair shirt next to the body, that person chooses to redefine the self. There is some intimation that the person not wearing a hair shirt is less desirable or less acceptable, or in the theological language of its time, less holy than the person who chooses to wear a lice-infested hair shirt. The decision to engage in the ascetical activity immediately posits two identities, two different ways of articulating a subjectivity. The first identity, the received subjectivity that does not require a hair shirt, who is given in the society in which the person lives, and the second person, an emergent subjectivity, who imagines that through the wearing of a hair shirt, a different person will emerge, a person significantly more improved than the received identity of the majority of people among whom the ascetic lives. Ascetical practice relates to the process of defining a new person, in opposition to a received and normative subjectivity promulgated in any society and cultural context. The question of the creation of an alternative identity in a wider culture perceived as being at odds with the alternative identity is an important one from the early part of the 21st century. The evidence for the pervasiveness of the aesthetical context in at least the 20th century may be amassed by simply listing some of the important movements whose aims were to construct an alternative identity within the dominant culture. Black power, the feminist movement, gay activism, libertarian communities, right-wing Christian separatists, religious and political communes, the ecology movement, and the many ethnic movements which promulgate the development of a countercultural Chicana, Asian, Pacific Rim, or Native American identity in the United States. And there are obviously many, many others. Each of these groups or movements find themselves caught between two subjectivities, one received from the wider cultural context and one developed in opposition to that dominant subjectivity in order to articulate or define an alternative way of living. The 21st century, bathed as it is in the blood of the clashing of various subjectivities, must address the question of the relationship of conflicting conceptualizations and enactments of the self. Pluralism, which is the ability of many diverse people to live together harmoniously, depends upon the capacity for diverse people to create and sustain identities at variance with each other, but who can live together. Religious pluralism demands that various religions' identities cohere in a social and political environment without either losing their distinctiveness, the distinctiveness of their own identity, or creating some identity that belongs to no one person in particular. Asceticism, which I here present as the practices to create those alternative identities, stands at the heart of pluralist religious, social, and political life. The postmodern context, however, needs to recognize the difference between training for a dominant society and training in subversive identities. This is actually the problem that the United States is facing in the war with Iraq, where, hi. This is the ILIF contingent that is now taking over.
ILIF DU.
ILIF DU contingent taking over the subjectivities of running. I haven't gotten anything interesting. I was just, this was all filler until you all arrived. There's a distinction that needs to be made between training for a dominant society and training in a subversive identity. And as I said, this is particularly important in the American context, where we assume that the entire world wants to have our dominant subjectivity, and there can be no other dominance, no other subjectivity that is competitive. Asceticism, which is the creation of an alternative identity, must be distinguished from formation, which is the creation of an identity equipped to function in the dominant society. This distinction deserves to be explored first, together with the ascetical theories of Foucault, one of the few philosophers or theorists that I will be dealing with today. Then I will develop a decidedly different genealogy of ascetical theory and practice in the 20th century that traces a different line of thought through two literary figures, Nikos Kazantzakis and Jean Genet, and two religious movements, the Branch Davidians and the Human Bombs of September 11. Formation or asceticism. This is the one section where I refer to Nietzsche. I did not put him in there. This was in there before I got invited here. But the differentiation differentiation of formation from asceticism may best be accomplished through exploring the following incident. This is a story, so you can relax. On the eve of July 1st in Greece, I'm Greek, so this is an experience that I've had. It is the beginning of the feast of the dual saints of healing, Cosmas and Damian, and they are called the Holy No Silver Ones, because because, according to the popular legends, they never asked for payment, silver, like the secular healers of their day. On this day, the Greek Orthodox community on the island of Paros in the Cyclades gathers at a remote and no longer inhabited monastery perched high above the village on a mountaintop for a festival evening. The festival begins with Vespers, or evening prayer. It's followed by a community supper. And then everyone goes home and comes back at sunrise the next morning for the celebration of the Eucharist. The little chapel, perched up there as it is normally dark and deserted, although it's always well kept and clean. It's decorated for the occasion. The icons on the walls are garlanded, as they were in pre-Christian antiquity, with red and white carnations. Embroidered and crocheted white cloths are hung below each of the large icons to cover the old wood of the icon screen. The brass hanging lamps are cleaned of their year's accumulation of olive oil. The candle stands are cleaned to prepare to receive the beeswax candles of the hundreds of pilgrims who will come to the celebration. At Vespers, the tiny chapel is packed with worshippers. Hundreds of candles illumine the space and make seeing in the otherwise dark chapel possible. On a small table in the middle of the cramped space stand 5 enormous loaves of bread, about that big, at least 2 feet in diameter, that will be blessed during the Vespers and distributed to the participants following the service. The Vesper begins about 9:30, although it is announced for 8 o'clock, and it continues until just about midnight. Unless you have some understanding of Orthodox religious ethos, this event might seem troublesome, boring, long, and without any apparent logic. My wife and I, who walked up the mountain instead of taking a cab or anything, arrived at 7:30 to be there on time, and of course nothing. We were not even, no one was up there. We were all by ourselves. We thought we were in the wrong place. However, once the participant learns some of the traditions associated with the festival, the celebration becomes clearer. Those traditions include the inauguration of a 2-day festival with Vespers on the eve of the Saint's Day, the blessing of loaves at the Vespers as part of the commemoration of the biblical feeding of the Israelites in the desert and the 5,000 by Jesus, and as an act of communal thanksgiving to God for sustenance and blessing. And the commonly known fact that Greeks normally do not even think about eating dinner until about midnight. Supplied with this information, the outsider then begins to understand the festival. It coheres and displays the community's corporate sense of religious identity. If you don't eat until midnight and the service precedes the meal, then the service has to start at 9:30 in order to end at midnight so that you can be eating at the right time. These festivals are carefully planned and orchestrated events celebrating the spirituality of the community and fulfilling the prayer needs of the community that understand these events. Various systems of formation exist for a group to communicate the systems necessary to understand and participate in its corporate life. The Parian Islanders, reared in an environment of festival celebrations, learn these systems from their earliest youth through their participation. They know that when the priest announces that the Vespers will be at 6 o'clock or 8 o'clock, that they don't even bother to show up until 9 or 10. Knowing something of the religious environment from Greek Orthodox practice here in the United States, where I was born, I could quickly pick up the peculiarities and nuances peculiar to the customs practice in Greece more generally, to Paros more specifically, and to this specific festival and the Feast of the Dual Saints more concretely. A tourist unfamiliar with Greek culture would probably neither know about the festival. The tourist would need to be familiar not only with Greek Orthodox calendar of saints, but also all the names of the local shrines and monasteries on the islands, nor would the tourist understand the various elements of the customary festival of the Feast of the Day. The festival would look like a late-night picnic delayed by a church service. To those who have knowledge, either as an insider or even as an outsider, the practices and traditions of the community bear witness that various systems of formations do indeed exist. A person must undergo a process of formation in order to understand and participate in the cultural event. Those processes of formation are not always self-evident. Michel Foucault, more than any other theorist of the postmodern era, has explored and documented these formational systems, both visible and submerged. that enable members of a society to be constituted as a subject of that society. But what Foucault describes as asceticism is perhaps best called formation. Foucault's study of the care of the self explored the means by which predominantly entitled male members of a society cultivated themselves in order to develop for themselves a mode of being consistent with the societal norms in which they live. Foucault's concept of the care of the self is this, and this is a quotation from him. It's what one might call an ascetical practice, giving the word ascetical a very general meaning. That is to say, not in the sense of abnegation, but that of an exercise of self upon the self by which one tries to work out, to transform oneself, and to attain a certain mode of being. What Foucault here calls asceticism ought more properly to be called cultural or social formation. The systems engaged in the care of the self are systems that enable the dominant males of the Greek and Roman period to form themselves as significant members of the dominant society by acquiring and I quote here from Foucault again, the knowledge of a certain number of rules of conduct or of principles which are at the same time truths and regulations. To care for the self is to fit oneself out with these truths, end quote. The social formation that motivated these Romans revolved about the development of a socially acceptable ethos. Foucault defines that ethos as, quote, the deportment and the way to behave. It was the subject's mode of being in a certain manner of acting visible to others, end quote. This ethos, Foucault argued, is directly related to the dominant social world in that, and again I quote, ethos implies also a relation with others to the extent that care for self renders one competent to occupy a place in the city, in the community, or in inter-individual relationships which are proper, whether it be to exercise a magistracy or to have a friendly relationship, end quote. In Foucault's thought, the care of the self aligns the person with a role and a function in the dominant society. This, I would argue, is not asceticism, but formation, because asceticism seeks precisely to define an alternative identity to the one that the dominant society promulgates. The distinction here is between exercises and practices intended to integrate a person into the dominant society and exercises and practices intended to create a subjectivity alternative and subversive to the dominant structure. This latter term I call asceticism, while the former ought to be called formation. In my differentiated system, formation is what has occurred when one is equipped to participate in the dominant culture, as in my example of the festival on Paros, while asceticism refers to the creation of an alternative subjectivity. Now we actually get into a little bit of Nietzsche. The distinction between formation and asceticism is one that, curiously enough, an important and influential source for Foucault articulated. Friedrich Nietzsche, beginning his third untimely meditation, entitled Schopenhauer as Educator, with a similar excursion into a tourist visit to a different land, articulates a distinction between the lazy person who accepts his socialization into the common mass culture, and the liberated person who strikes out free from the constraints of custom to construct his own identity. Nietzsche characterizes the lazy person as the one who acts from fear of his neighbor, and this is a quote, who demand conventionality and cloaks himself with it, end quote, and who is constrained to, quote, think and to act like a member of a herd, end quote, with indolence, inertia, in short, that tendency to laziness. Great 19th and 20th century language. This lazy person remains, quote, fettered by the chains of fear and convention, end quote. In contrast to this person is the youthful soul, who understands the conventionality as far distant from its true self because, quote, its liberation gives it a presentment of the measure of happiness allotted it from all eternity. This liberated person quote, knows quite well that being unique, he will be in the world only once, and that no imaginable chance will for a second time gather into a unity so strangely variegated and an assortment as he is, end quote. This youthful person constructs the way proper only to the individual, singular, unique, unfettered, and far distant from the person society constructs for itself. Nietzsche instructs the youthful soul, quote, let the youthful soul look back on the life with the question, what have you truly loved up to now? What has drawn your soul aloft? What has mastered it and at the same time blessed it? Set up these revered objects before you, and perhaps their nature and their sequence will give you a law, the fundamental law of your own true self. Compare these objects with one another. See how one completes, expands, surpasses, transfigures another, how they constitute a step ladder upon which you have clambered up to yourself as you are now. For your true nature lies not concealed deep within you, but immeasurably high above you, or at least above that which you usually take yourself to be, end quote. Nietzsche draws a stark contrast between the person formed by the dominant social paradigm for the mass culture, the person whose primary identity is provided by the social convention of the day, and the other person who actively subverts that conventional formation to develop itself that actualizes the unique qualities and interests and gifts of an identity no longer constrained by convention or society. Nietzsche has framed an issue central to 20th and 21st century people. The differentiation between a formation to construct an identity oriented toward living in the dominant society and the choice to subvert that formation and to step out into the uncharted territory to construct a wholly other identity. I call Nietzsche's lazy person's training formation and the youthful soul's alternative asceticism. A differentiation of formation from asceticism maps out the first distinction necessary for this study of asceticism. Formation describes the activity whereby a person becomes a functioning member of a dominant group or society. Formational processes equip members of a group for full participation and engagement through their engagement in the group's normative practices expressed in such systems as etiquette, social propriety, participation in ceremonial events and activities, as well as other customary practices. Now I'm going to turn to what I call a genealogy of ascetical studies in this period, or at least in the last 20 or 30 years. There is a genealogy to this concept of the ascetical creation of an alternative subjective identity that can maybe summarize through four particular events in the 20th century that thrust asceticism into the fore of academic and social awareness. The first event is the ascetical exercises of Nikos Kazantzakis, who in 1922 to 23 created the first post-Eastern Christian secular ascetical theology. Kazantzakis, writing during a period of clashing cultures, political structures, and intellectual foment, promulgated an ascetical discipline intended to create a new and different understanding of modern identity, precisely to address the problems of modern existence. The second event of my genealogy revolves about the novels and plays of Jean Genet, writing in the 1940s and 50s, who translated Western ascetical practice into gay life, and from gay life it found its way into French critical theory. Genet connected his efforts at defining a new identity to the Black Power movement in the United States, the gay activist movements in Europe, and the Palestinian effort to maintain a subversive identity in the context of the creation of the State of Israel. Genet's literary identities provided the context for the exploration of an ascetical identity in the midst of seriously conflicted modern identities. The third event of my genealogy is more recent, the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. The Branch Davidians brought alternative religious identity to the fore of American attention. Their religious alterity, linked with their libertarian political views and their apocalyptic religious beliefs and practices, at once condemned normative American values and practices and showed that some Americans were willing to risk everything to live by a different set of rules. Their alternative subjectivity ultimately related to their willingness to train themselves to become all fire, a tradition, as we will see, with ancient roots among the Egyptian desert monks. The fourth event in my genealogy is even more recent. The Muslim martyr heroes who were trained to turn themselves and their fellow passengers into human bombs in the terrorist attack on the United States on September 11, 2001. These human bombs, when they practiced the identity for which they had so carefully been trained, became an effective display of the extent to which alternative religious and political practices contend with dominant subjectivities in order to assert their distinctiveness. Kazantzakis and Genet, even though literary leaders of their generation, have been intellectually marginalized, especially as regards their ascetic theories. But the Branch Davidians and the world trade terrorists have captivated global attention in an unprecedented way. Nikos Kazantzakis. In the latter part of the 20th century, the Western world came to know Nikos Kazantzakis primarily through the cinematic renditions of two of his most influential novels, The Last Temptation of Christ, which presented a view of Christ's own emergence as a savior, often against his own will, and Zorba the Greek, which dramatized the character that became quintessentially the Greek man struggling against an interior and exterior fate. I was in the generation that had to read Zorba all the time, and then listen, of course, to Zorba the Greek on music for the next 35 years. But that gives you some sense of the cultural coin that was there. The dramatic characterizations of Jesus, Paul, Mary Magdalene, Zorba, and the many other characters, both major and minor, in these novels and films attracted the attention of artistic leaders and the imagination of the general viewing public. Kazantzakis based his characterization on a specific theory of asceticism that he developed early in his career. In 1922 to 23, Kazantzakis produced the first post-Christian ascetical theology in his book entitled Ascetici Salvatoris Dei, which has been translated into English as The Saviors of God, Spiritual Exercises. His ascetical work became a centerpiece, perhaps more appropriately a manifesto, for his philosophical, theological, political, and literary productions, because each of his subsequent works presents various aspects of the theories and practices advocated in his ascetical theology. Kazantzakis considered his ascetical theology central to his intellectual, political, literary, and spiritual projects, but it has remained largely unknown. You can't put ascetical theology on music. The world, unfortunately, for the ascetical theologian. The Western world was not interested in pursuing the pure art of asceticism until today, when ascetical formation takes on a terrorist purpose. The fact that Kazantzakis' ascetical theology is post-Christian makes it very interesting. Being nurtured in a highly ascetical religious environment in the Greek Orthodox Church in Crete, and having spent formative lives living among the ascetical monks of Mount Athos, Kazantzakis nonetheless rejected Christianity as the primary advocate and means of ascetical behavior. For Kazantzakis, asceticism provided primarily the means to, as he would call it, transubstantiate the flesh, or transubstantiate materiality into spirit. His post-Christian ascetical theology moved towards the founding of a new religious perspective resonant with all the currents of the period between the two world wars. His ascetical theology combined in various ways Marxism, communist theory and practice, radical Greek identity, the philosophy of Nietzsche, the teaching of Bergson, and readings in Buddhism. It was written as a post-Christian response to the rise of nationalism, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and the consequent creation of modern Turkey and Greece, the spread of communism in Eastern Europe, and the modern critical intellectual climate of Germany and France. Kazantzakis realized that the New World Order and the new ways of thinking about personality, society, and politics required a different understanding of subjectivity. According to Kazantzakis, the world could not survive without a drastic reordering of the role and significance of individual effort in order to advance the human state to the next level of evolution. His ascetical theology provided a scheme for this reordering of society and the symbolic universe. His vision was prophetic for the beginning of the 21st century. The center of Kazantzakis' ascetical agenda revolves about what he called the superhuman struggle. Ho, for those of you who are in the Greek class, ho hyperanthropinos agonas. Based on an understanding of the evolution of material culture towards some spiritual end, Kazantzakis understood the human endeavor as the propelling agent that could force evolution into its next stage. His ascetical program included 5 parts, 5 states. Preparation, hyperethemasia, the walk along the road or the march, hyporia, the visions, ta orama, practice, hypraxi, and silence, isigi. Further elaboration of asceticism need not detain us here. What is important is that Kazantzakis developed and articulated a full ascetical system as a response to the significant changes in the society around him. That ascetical system recognized the important role of the transformation of an individual subjectivity as the means whereby further social and political development could occur. Kazantzakis lived at the perimeter, on the boundary, and this is an important image for him taken from the Byzantine figure, the Yelis Akritis, whose name means the guard of the boundary. Of many worlds, Eastern and Western philosophy, modern and modern political structures, Eastern Christianity and Western, agricultural life and industrial society, among many others. It is precisely this sense of being neither one nor the other that led him to articulate an ascetical theology. His goal was to provide a means for people, including himself, to move forward amidst the remarkably divergent systems of power in the midst of dramatic social and political changes. The old structures that nurtured him and the West in its youth no longer could sustain themselves. Some new way of living, of being an agent in the world, of forming social alliances and families, and of conceptualizing the meaning and significance of the cosmos was necessary. For Kazantzakis, these new things begin and end in human transformation, in the creation of a subjectivity capable of carrying self, society, and world to a new level of spiritual and political awareness. Kazantzakis' instinct towards asceticism, probably arising in his border experiences in Eastern Orthodox trained intellect engaged in Western philosophy, itself almost impossible to conceive, put the question of formation on the modern agenda. Although we know his asceticism primarily through characters he developed to dramatize his ascetical theory, we have nonetheless been invited into an ascetical world that has held our fascination. Jean Genet. In contrast to Kazantzakis' move towards a post-Christian ascetical theological system, Jean Genet, 1910 to 1986, took up the question of the construction of a new subjectivity in literature. Genet opened new possibilities for experiencing new subjectivities by taking the reader into the minds and experiences of characters who display their ability to create new identities out of the often harmful elements of their true lives. Genet's own ascetical formation has 2 formative loci. First, he was raised as a foundling, placed in a foster family in the rural village of Aligny-en-Morvan, and rural life for the Regnault family revolved about the local Roman Catholic parish where Genet was a chorister and an acolyte, and where Genet was baptized, received a Catholic religious education, and received his first communion. This youthful formation in the rituals, practices, festivals, and music of the church resonates throughout Genet's novels. His characters take on religious significance. One queen, for example, in Our Lady of the Flowers, is called First Communion, while another, Divine, rises at cockscrow to go to communion, the quite repentant. And even observe traditional ascetical disciplines in a completely gay context. The narrator relates, quote, "Now the fact is that Divine wore next to her skin a clinging hair shirt, unsuspected by Darling and her clients." End quote. Genet applies his religious experience and his formative ascetical practices to the life of his gay characters. The second locus of Genet's own ascetical formation took place at Maitreys, an agricultural reformatory for young offenders of the law. Maitreys' program of reformation revolved about the rigorous monastic style regimen of hard work, enforced religious training, and harsh discipline for those breaking the rules in an all-male environment. The ascetical and severely disciplined life fused with the Roman Catholic religious asceticism of his youth to produce a uniquely gay asceticism, modeled on ecclesiastical practices, but applied in an entirely different context of male homosexuality. Genet's asceticism revolved about a program to enact a gay identity, or more properly, gay identities, in the context of a gay community. His characters act out their gay life, referring to each other in the feminine, a process that is enhanced by the narrator at various points, providing the masculine birth names of his characters when they are brought into court, revealing their inner thoughts, and especially their sexual desires, and living out their lives in the context of male homosexual love, prostitution, transvestitism, and society. In this process, Genet creates a gay culture, parallel to the heterosexual norm in French society, but entirely subversive of it. This gay world that he creates resonates with the vibrancy of a subversive and often dangerous counterculture in which male homosexuals dominate, in which the male-female roles of the normal culture have become translated into the pimp queen, active and passive members of active and passive members of gay coupling. The world in which these gay characters live is not the one into which they were born, but one into which they must be initiated. They follow a sort of monastic novitiate, training to learn the precise practices, how to live as a queen, how to cross-dress, how to create the gestures that at once invoke feminine but expose the gay significance and context, how to greet one another, how to relate to one's pimp. In short, a complete novitiate training in gay culture and life. Genet accomplishes his ascetical agenda in his novels and plays by piecing together what Richard Schechner, the performance theorist, calls malleable bits of experience. In writing Genet's biography, Edmund White repeatedly shows how Genet refracts events or elements of his life in his character gestures and events of his characters. Genet does not produce a simple and plain autobiography, because each of the elements seems to be changed or adjusted, refracted in that process, break away from the real events of his life into the fictive elements in the construction of a character. Genet creates identity out of the malleable bits of experience refracted through past, present, and imaginary time. It can easily and generally be concluded that the middle of the 20th century and into the 21st century witnessed the emergence of a wide assortment of subversive and alternative identities, modeled, in a sense, on that structure that Genet created. I only need to point out to the sexual revolution of the 60s, the emergence of a feminist movement in the 70s and 80s, the radicalized, especially in response to the AIDS pandemic, gay activist movement of the 90s. All of these movements tended toward the construction of alternative subjectivities, societies, and understandings of the symbolic universe. They were all in one form or another ascetical movements, according to my understanding. Jean Genet provided a significant starting point in the literary scene for the construction of such alternative subjectivities. They get shorter, the next two are shorter. The Branch Davidians. How many of you remember the Branch Davidians? You know? Okay, that's it. Alternative subjectivities in the 20th century did not remain.
Sorry, there's a heckler back there.
Good, that's all right. Alternative subjectivities in the 20th century did not remain the province of sexual or gender radicals. Conservative religious groups also began to form intentionally in ascetic communities. The Branch Davidians of Waco, Texas, provides an exemplar of such communities. On February 28, 1993, when the agents of the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation began their standoff with the Branch Davidians at their community center at Waco, Texas, the United States awakened to the existence of radical conservative Christian ascetical communities within its border. The standoff ended on April 19, 1993, when the confrontation erupted into violence and the community buildings of the Branch Davidians burst into flames, killing 86 people, among whom were 17 children. The Branch Davidians went nobly and fearlessly to their deaths, with only 9 surviving members of the Waco community, excepting those, of course, who had been released during the standoff. In every way, the Branch Davidians were an ascetic community. Their community was formed in opposition to the dominant religious and political culture around them in the United States and throughout the world. They held apocalyptic views of the end times, metaphorized as a fiery ordeal in the tradition of the biblical book of the Revelation of John, which views affirmed by their biblical interpretation, and it led them to withdraw from society to a sacred place apart. Imagine that in Texas. Their status as the elect, who could rightly perceive and understand God, in contradistinction to all others, supported their living a common life of intense biblical study, common belongings, corporate meals, and mutual support and love. Their community was organized around the messianic self-understanding of their leader, who had adopted the religious name David Koresh. Their common life, focused as it was on Koresh, organized itself as a religious militia prepared to join God in the destruction of the evil forces of the universe, an army prepared to join in the fiery ordeal that would end the beastly power of the United States and the evil government forces of the world. They were prepared to jump into the fiery ordeal in order to assist God in the establishment of a theocratic world government, the reign of God on earth under God's own Messiah, David Koresh. Little is known of the interior workings of the community. There is no evidence of a written rule or a description of their daily life. Most of the surviving evidence revolves about biblical interpretation, the teaching of which became the central corporate act of their communal living, as evidenced in the large number of transcribed tapes available from their regular Bible study classes. Livingstone Fagan, one of those released from the community during the standoff, has provided a precious insight into the theory of formation operative among the Branch Davidians in an appendix to a larger biblical interpretive piece entitled Intuition, the Emerging Soul. The larger piece is phenomenally boring and very confused, but this last piece actually begins to make some sense. It's almost ranting, and then you get to this little place where he's trying to explain everything, because by that time he was probably confused about what he was saying. But Fagan describes the goal of the process as the ability, quote, to think God's thoughts after him, the source of true judgment, end quote. This ability to assimilate and to appropriate God's thinking is tied to the developing of the person, here called the fledgling soul. I'm wondering if you had read Nietzsche, which emerges from, quote, intuition, the combined effect of the senses and seed of judgment on the fledgling soul, end quote. Intuition, together with the development of conscience, enables and empowers one to think God's thoughts. Fagin's argument follows in this way, and this is a quote. By themselves, our thoughts are really ethereal labels attached to the feelings, processes, and objects of our senses. True thoughts begin with intuition. That's not something, by the way, you should write on your exams. Because that won't get you very far. But true thoughts, he writes, begins with intuition and with the aid of conscience, mature into judgments. Such judgments form the basis for true, correct thinking, producing its corresponding thoughts. At each level, feelings, intuition, judgment, thinking, a new phase of consciousness emerges. In the light of each development, the understanding of the previous level is completed, becoming situated in true thinking. The soul is ready for birth. What Fagin describes here is the development of a totally new person whose soul is birthed through a process of initiation and training. That training consists of the reformation of thinking or thought according to a system that has been deemed true, presumably in opposition to the false thoughts completely oriented to the senses or to the physical world. The oppositions here are telling: fledgling soul versus mature soul, sensual versus divine thinking, lower levels of judgment versus higher levels of judgment. Intuition guides the person towards the mature, divine, and higher life that produces a new birth, a new person, a new subjectivity, capable of thinking God's thoughts. In the process of being guided toward that new birth, the conscience of the person develops more fully, creating a new consciousness. This is a process gradually intended completely to reform the subjectivity of the believer. Fagin emphasizes that the process is a complete program. It cannot be stopped before the complete transformation of the person is completed. He writes, "The importance of conscience in this process cannot be underestimated. It is like the umbilical cord of the developing child in the womb, the fledgling's link to the soul of the universe from which it is nourished and takes its form. Cut prior to maturity, and the soul fails of coming to birth. It dies and ultimately returns to nothing. As with a soul, so with a nation." Two issues emerge here as central. The first is that without the training found in the community of believers, a person cannot thrive. Without the training available to the community, the fledgling is doomed to death. Wisdom, salvation, health, vitality flow only from the ascetical training and practices within the community. The second issue, more striking, is the linking of the microcosmic soul's fate with the macrocosmic fate of the nation. This innocuous-seeming comment, almost as a simple addendum, indicates that there is a larger and more social component to this ascetical process. This is not a process intended simply to create spiritually reborn people. It is also a process intended to create a spiritually renewed nation. The ascetical disciplines at the microcosmic level create simultaneously a nation and a culture. They would probably call it a world at the microcosmic level. The individual identity connects directly to the specific social environment and to a specific understanding of the goal and purpose of human existence, articulated in the community's theology. Finally, Fagin connects this understanding of human spiritual identity and the construction of the New World Order to the biblical interpretation so familiar as a practice in the community. And here is a quote. "The mature soul combines thinking and its corresponding thoughts, the one male and the other female, the perfect image of God. At the birthing, they are placed in separate forms and are one, completely in touch with every aspect of each other, perfectly mated. This is God's ideal of marriage, of which Adam and Eve, in their innocence, were an example. His being formed was an object lesson in order. Her being the more beautiful, it was necessary for her to be formed from living substance, not rather than raw dust, the majesty of femininity. This ideal has been blighted by sin and has degenerated to what we have today. The plan of salvation incorporates its restoration. Of a truth, the soul is created from nothing, coming via dust. In the kingdom of God, we are born perfectly mated. End quote. Here Fagin provides us with a theological rationale for the whole system emergent from an interpretation of the purpose of human existence in the first two chapters of Genesis. The system of training, so non-biblical in its language and metaphor, becomes biblical because it is identified with a proper understanding of Adam and Eve's creation. Chillingly, the metaphor of marriage opens the possibility of sexual abuse of women and children by the messianic figure. But the metaphor becomes naturalized in the interpretative process so that the concepts of restoration, of perfect mating, of a divided whole, presumably brought together in coitus, of the image of God, all flow logically and properly from their biblical interpretation. Fagin may properly claim that he merely explains the deeper meaning of Scripture. This deeper level of understanding, however, provides the clue to all the other elements of the formative process. It is the creation of a symbolic universe that sustains alternative subjectivity and gives depth to the construction of an alternative society or nation. What ended in the fiery ordeal at the Branch Davidian community in Waco, Texas, was the logical conclusion of an intensive and complete ascetical training. The members of that community were trained to become living warriors, willing to die in the heavenly conflagration that was to befall this sinful and evil world. In an odd paradox, their experience recalls a saying from the Desert Fathers that preceded them by at least 1,600 years, which parallels the metaphor and the process. Let me quote it. It's my favorite, which is why I always quote it. Abba Lot received Abba Joseph and said to him, Abba, according to my ability, I perform my order of prayer a little, I fast a little, I pray and meditate in silence, and as far as I'm able, I cleanse my thoughts. What more remains then that I must do? When the old man arose, he stretched out his hands to heaven. His fingers became as 10 lamps of fire, and he said to him, if you wish, become entirely as fire. Just as in antiquity, a more proficient monk could encourage a less proficient monk to become entirely as fire and provide the monk with the disciplines to achieve it, so did David Koresh in the modern period train and equip his religious community to become living fires, living flames that were intended to birth a new nation, a new era, a new kingdom of God. The ascetical training then and now were probably very different, as would be the theological rationale, but the ascetically formative processes were probably resonant, if not similar. The terrorist attacks of September 11th. It is but a short ascetical jump from becoming a living flame inaugurating the kingdom to becoming human bombs. I began writing this paper in the aftermath of September 11, 2001, bombing of the World Trade Center buildings in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, and during the intense fighting between Israeli and Palestinian Authority in the spring of 2002. After the terrorist attacks on American soil, the nature of American identity, power, and self-awareness, so long lived as dominant and unquestionably supreme, shifted way permanently in the face of what had been called martyr heroes of the jihad. These human bombs provide the fourth political, social, and cultural event that has put asceticism on a postmodern agenda. In an article in the New Yorker, November 19, 2001, Nasra Hassan, I should say after, reports on the training of Shahid Batal, the martyr heroes of the Palestinian uprising against Israel. Her account, without ever mentioning the word or the concept, relates an ascetical regime for young men to train themselves not only to become human bomb, but also to become a martyr for the cause of the Holy War. The training in martyrdom, as Hassan reports them, revolved about a nexus of important elements. The promise of immediate entrance into paradise upon their self-imposed death. A constant state of worship, as one of the martyrs in training described it. The attractiveness of a spiritually uplifting project. The close support of a cell of people called an al-Kahiyya al-Istishhadiyya, a martyrdom cell, whose life acquires an intensity based on a common holy calling, the love for the Holy Scriptures that gives contours and depth to the actions of the martyrs, the fame and blessing bestowed upon the family and community of the martyr, and the clear sense of calling by clerics indirectly, or from Allah directly to a holy office and offering, and finally the joy of knowing that there will be a victory over the enemies of Islam. The young men selected for this office are carefully trained. The religious guides employ videos of exemplars of martyrs and model behavior, attitudes, and postures as they prepare themselves for their sacrifice. The guides reinforce such visual imagery with recitation and memorization of the Quranic passages that justify and glorify their mission, while emphasizing the rewards of their sacrifice on behalf of Allah. Recited questions and responses that train the mind in new ways of thinking of themselves and the world reinforce the learning and help the martyr in training to image themselves in their chosen vocation. Signs and posters glorifying previous martyrs and their successes provide visual and verbal support from the religious and secular community around them to encourage the martyrs in their preparation, even though members of the community do not know specifically who those being trained are. And of course, the profound sense of oppression from the enemy, both in their personal experience and in the indoctrination of the martyrs' guides, grounds their determination to become martyrs. This sense of oppression for the dominant society provides the greatest impetus and drives the martyr in training to overcome their fear of death and, more importantly, fear of failure through the exercise of their religious strength and determination. It is a complete ascetical training, provided to youths willing to accept the community's call to fight the holy war. So these four elements, Kazantzakis, Genet, the Branch Davidians, and the human bombs, form a genealogy of asceticism that covers the expanse of the 20th century. And it shows both the timely importance of understanding asceticism because of the impact of terrorist ascetical enclaves, and its interconnection with intellectual and literary movements in the work of Kazantzakis and Genet. The genealogy of the modern interest in asceticism points to the complexity of its forms and to the significance of its contemporary discourse. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
You say that the difference between libertarian ascetics who strive towards a theocracy on one side and Christian conservative born again who also strive towards a theocracy, that their difference is precisely asceticism, then there is a formation and a sacrifice on the libertarian ascetics, and there is no formation and no sacrifice except stupidity, with the born-again Christians who are really pushing for a theocracy.
What I would argue is that it's actually the basis of their similarity. That unless you understand the ascetical processes, particularly of a subversive identity, you cannot make the equation or connect the work of right-wing religious conservatives of any sort, Christian or Muslim or Jewish, for that matter, with other communities. It is precisely the fact that they are all engaged in a kind of formation that brings them into alignment and therefore offers an opportunity to study. What shifts is the content of the theocracy. The metaphors used to do it. It was different for the Branch Davidians than for the martyrs, although their formation was similar. It was different in content from the ancient monks trying to become all fire, and the Branch Davidians in their attempt to become all fire. But their patterns of formation were remarkably similar.
Yeah, but this is not true about Christian conservatives, born again conservatives.
Oh, I
There's
think
no fire. They say there is, but there is no fire. There is security, bourgeois values, and Republican aspirations. So the difference is enormous.
Well,
but we have the end, which
but
is formation of
whether
theocracies.
it is a conscious system of formation. In fact, most religious conservatives are in fact formed. I mean, people are not born to be literalist readers of Scripture. There's a whole tradition that you have to be initiated into to understand reading the Bible in that way. And therefore, that initiatory process is in fact a formation. I mean, that's why you have a certain alignment of certain kinds of music with certain kinds of ways of reading Scripture, of certain kinds of social relationships and religious relationships, certain kinds of moral stances that reinforce all of the other things in the element. All of that is a complete system of formation that people are initiated into. It's one of the reasons, for example, that organizations like Campus Crusade for Christ are so effective. They have the system of formation down very, very pat, and they are able to communicate that quickly and efficiently and effectively to their constituency.
I heard Irving asking a question, or let me put the question differently anyway. Would you say that, those who engage, who are actively involved in, let's take an organization, Campus Crusade for Christ, they hadn't come to mind before, but let's take them. Would you put them in the ascetic category or the formation category? Are they the lazy persons? In the lazy persons, I mean, because I hear part of what Irving was saying, I think, about there's no sacrifices. He was talking about those of a conservative bent, but who wouldn't end up with David Koresh in Waco. In other words, I don't think we can talk about all conservative religious Christians in the same category here. Some of them might be in the asceticism category the way you're using it, and some in the formation category. Or could you speak to that? And sometimes, and the follow-up question I want you to answer too is, some of these groups claim to be the subversive one. In other words, they'll say the dominant culture is decadent, immoral. We can hear this already from our own leaders who can portray themselves as representing alterity and social change, when some of us see them as representing sameness and traditionalism and just kind of unthinking, continuity of what's been done and not at all self-reflection. So could you comment on that too?
Part of it depends on context. In the United States, where even though the kind of evangelical religious conservative modality is seen as a minority position, in fact it is the dominant position.
That's right.
And when the New York Times quotes anything, the dominant perspective on what religion in America is, whether you're Jewish, Muslim, or anything else, is Protestant evangelical Christianity. That is the marker against which all religious realities are measured, even by liberals. So, in this country, then the Campus Crusade would be part of formation, because they are preparing people to become a part of what is the religiously dominant perspective. If you were to take those same things to, say, Haiti, where this is an experience that I had, where we were up in the mountains in Haiti, and there was a little Baptist church built up there that looked like a New England Baptist church with a steeple. And the pastor wore, in this heat, and a black suit, a white shirt, and a black tie, looking just like every Baptist minister I ever saw in New England. He spoke in English, even though the people could only speak Creole. That was an asceticism in that environment. The same thing in New England would be part of formation, but if you transplant it into a place where it isn't the dominant, then it becomes a kind of asceticism. Theoretically, this pastor in Haiti wanted to initiate people into this kind of way of religiosity that wasn't their own.
If I'm hearing you correctly, though, perspective, that question of perspective is very important about whether it's becoming formation or asceticism, given how you define those, so that even within groups that, however we define the dominant culture, would say is ascetical, there becomes a formative practice which then can have its own splinter groups, etc., so that you're proposing a theory which can work at multiple levels and even within subgroupings. Is that?
Yeah.
I was wondering about how you understand asceticism in this broad sense of creating alternative identities. With respect to asceticism in the more traditional sense of exercises and diet, sleeping, sexual renunciation, that sort of thing. Because and it seems to me that when ascesis is carried out, it's always carried out upon some kind of underlying nature, and there has to be an understanding there of the nature that is to be formed, or formed in opposition to, say, the society's dominant values. Do you see that?
Yeah, the argument in late antiquity and early Christianity around issues of formation is an argument between people who say that the practices define asceticism. And this actually came out of Gail Street's work, a mutual friend of ours. No, it was not. It was Gail Corrington Street's work, where she said, what is the difference between a woman who fasts in order and deprives herself until she stops menstruating as a religious identity, and a woman suffering from anorexia? They are both doing exactly the same thing, but she said they don't mean the same. They don't mean the same. So it's not the practice that actually informs what is ascetical, but the context. There are some women in Gail's work, for example, some women who are anorectic in order precisely to create a more beautiful person in their minds, at least. And so that their fasting is in fact, their self-denial is in fact an attempt to create an alternative personality. That, she would say, was an ascetical activity. There are others who are simply self-destructive, who are trying to commit suicide. That's not an ascetical thing. So that the reason to put it into a larger context of an alternative subjectivity is precisely to account for being able to identify the kind of ascetical disciplines that's going on. In our culture, the gym is our primary ascetical place. And just look at the bodies around you when you go to the gym. They are intended to be on display as, the perfectly divine human being. That with certain kinds of efforts you can become, and television reinforces that, and ads and everything, everything sort of buys into that image that there is one perfect body and none of us has it. But with the proper discipline. But in a sense, that's exactly the same kind of effort that was put into the ascetical disciplines of antiquity.
I'm just struggling with the definition of what an ascetic is, and sounds like some of the things that you mentioned, which were components to asceticism, were religious deprivation, opposition, sacrificial or apocalyptic spirit, and someone who withdraws from the mainstream. And what you just said about the gym tells me that religious is a dispensable part of the definition.
Yeah.
So I guess the general question is, what's on the short bullet list of things that make an ascetic an ascetic? And just a sort of sub-question is, what kind of deprivation makes an ascetic? Is it relative to the culture, or is it, can you be in, I mean, if you're in a culture of luxury, does having one car push you towards asceticism? No, I mean, is it relative to the wealth of the society and the comfort and luxury of the society, or is it anyone who takes it right down to survival and then just maybe a little extra?
Yeah, I think to one car and otherwise, or having only one car that's not an SUV is certainly a mark of asceticism. My definition, if I would, and this will continue into working out my own definition, which I sort of put out for a while for discussion, is asceticism are performances intended to inaugurate a new subjectivity, performances within a dominant culture intended to inaugurate an alternative subjectivity, new social relationships, and a different understanding of the symbolic universe. So that it involves performances, it involves doing something. That's usually under the category of withdrawal or deprivation or choosing an alternative of some sort. The alternative subjectivity is usually defined in opposition to something else, perceived as a dominant perspective that is rejected. Social relationships that undergird that new subjectivity and provide it with a different context, as well as with a different set of relationships. And then that also results in an alternate, different way of describing the symbolic universe that gives meaning and expression to activities.
So if I joined a Hummer Club, okay, just as a possible example.
If you could find a parking space for
right,
it.
if I join a Hummer Club, it's a performance intended to inaugurate a new alternate subjectivity, right? That of hyper machismo, super dominance. The club would be the new society which would support that, and so this would not be deprivation. This would be piling stuff on to exaggerate the
There
thing.
is an asceticism of excess.
And then the worldview would be a view of the world as bountiful and always able to supply what we need.
That's right, and an unlimited supply of desert to drive your Hummer, like the ads do. Drive your Hummer. You can drive from the desert right into downtown Denver and find a parking space, and not be crunched in by cars on both
So the
sides.
members of the Hummer Club would be ascetics.
That would be an
Okay.
ascetical. That would be an ascetical discipline.
Okay.
And the reason I expand the horizon is precisely in order to accommodate movements within American and Western culture in particular that seem to take on a life of their own that are unexamined, like Hummer ownership.
They're so misunderstood.
There's so the dominant culture just doesn't understand. But also gyms, terrorists, and Waco. I mean, these are things that I don't think we as Americans have dealt with. We deal with things by saying they are simply crazy, which is what it's called Waco, Texas, instead of Waco, Texas. You know, they were crazy. Well, no, that was a religious movement that is actually indicative of various kinds of movements within the United States, along a very wide spectrum of movements. At this point, I think both the Democratic and Republican parties are cults. You know, because the way they're trying to inculcate everybody, from their earliest days into being one or the other, and don't think, just respond. We'll tell you what to think. All of that kind of formation that is happening, and the impact on education in particular, because what is happening, education is one, as Foucault would argue, both a formative and an ascetical system. Its capacity to create a society is enormous, and yet that's not really taken as a serious formative. We're not discussing that as a serious formative institution. We're discussing testing and other kinds of things that seem to indicate that there's no formation going on here at all. Whereas in fact, as anybody who's involved in education, either in any form, knows that it is an enormously formative experience that creates new and alternative subjectivities. The person who comes in should not be, and is not generally, the person who goes out of the classroom. You're asking too many hard questions.
Well, no, this is an interesting question because it concerns Genet and de Sade. Would you say that pleasure can be a part of the aesthetic movement exercise? Because
Well,
masochists derive both pleasure and pain, and they do want to develop a new personality to go into a new realm.
Yeah.
The same with pain itself, never mind sexual masochism. People who flagellate themselves, sometimes I have been told, there is a great deal of pleasure in feeling the blood running down and so forth. So how do you explain?
Well, in non-Western ascetical systems, both sexual pleasure and pain are legitimate ascetical disciplines. I mean, the tantric tradition is a complete ascetical system for physical or sexual pleasure. That's why I move away from specific practices and talk about the whole question of de Sade and that kind of masochistic energy was enormously influential in some of the major theorists of the 20th century, as was Genet. If you read the biographies of Foucault, of the other leaders, Bach and the others of the leaders of the kind of hermeneutical movement of the late 20th century, late 20th century, they all intersected with Genet in one form or another. And so and it was through that, I think, that the whole question of asceticism entered into Foucault's mind. That it really was that exposure, and it's clearer when you read Saint Genet, Foucault's biography. It's clearer there of the influence that had, that reminded all of them of their Jesuit religious formation. So they left aside the religious meanings of it, but kept the ascetical disciplines, and then began to apply them in other ways. I mean, the way in which deconstruction happens in someone like de Certeau and others is precisely the way in which ascetical reconstruction of thinking happens in the ancient literature, where a category is at once posited and then taken away, cataphatic and apophatic thinking. So yeah, I think they are related.
Richard, could you say more? I'm interested in the places in which formation or the dominant culture and asceticism and the subversive culture overlap, even though they construct themselves in opposition to one another and would, at least in their discourse and as they develop themselves, articulate that they're the antithesis of the other. So, but there are ways in which you're talking about the overlap, wittingly or unwittingly. So, for example, in Genet, a figure I know a little about, but in the case of, except for a few plays and things, he took certain religious practices and a certain kind of environment and a certain, I want to say, ethos with him to develop a new goal, an alternative, both subjectivity and sort of envision idealized society in the way you described it, but there's continuities there. Or for example, in the branch Davidians, there are certain overwhelming, a lot of overlapping areas with kind of mainline Protestant Christianity. So could you just talk about some of the ways in which they are related but yet become antithetical? And
It's actually easiest to do if I use the relationship of the monastery to the larger church. The larger church defines itself in opposition to the world. however that's defined, the Roman Empire. So the church is the ascetic. In relationship to the Roman Empire, the church is an ascetical discipline. The monks define themselves in opposition to the church, which defines itself in opposition to the... So in relationship to the church, a monastery is an ascetical discipline. A hermit who goes to live outside of the monastery is defining himself in opposition to a monk living in community who defines himself in opposition to the church, which defines itself in opposition to the world. So that there are in all of those commonalities. But the minute you begin to define yourself in opposition to is when you begin to think ascetically. The minute you begin to do there was probably a formative practice related to how you became a Christian or a member of that community at each level that was the same across everyone, whether you were a hermit or a bishop of a diocese. So those formative processes would have been similar, but asceticism kicks in at the point at which the alternative is beginning to be defined. And that's a scale. Yes, there are parts of what the Branch Davidians did that actually is directly related to what a lot of stuff you read on the net. If you go surfing for, religious sites on the net, you'll see the same stuff. The difference is that they weren't, that in that place, that they're really not necessarily trying to guide a person into an alternative subjectivity to the degree that the Waco community, Branch Davidians did.
We have some students and probably faculty members too who have to go to a 2:30 class. So let's continue our discussion afterwards, and we have food and refreshments. But let's all thank Professor Valantasis.
You didn't get to ask your question.
Well, I was just going to say, I know this would never happen if you found yourself on Nietzsche's what would you find?
No, I'm serious. Demonization is solving a problem.
Right.
And so the formation needs to happen in the military and not. You don't. I don't know that you don't.
I think there's some in there. Yeah, if it's not on, just press the button. Turn the green light on.
Automatically define yourself as the other. Even